Hey, do me a favor later on today when you're with some friends, tell them that at church today you sang a hymn with the words "Dooby Ooby Walla Dooby Abba Dabba." Just want you to see the look on their face when you say that. The person who wrote that song must have been the same person who wrote the theme for the Flintstones. Yabba Dabba Doo. The musical Hair opened off Broadway in New York City on October 17th, 1967 at Joe Papp's Public Theater. So that means we're 12 days away from its 47th anniversary. Wow, can you believe that? Hair sure caused a lot of stir 47 years ago with its rock music, its racially integrated cast, and of course, its nude scene, which we will not be doing for you today. After the show ran off Broadway for a while, it opened on Broadway a year later in 1968 and had 1,750 performances. The London production had 1,997 performances, almost 2,000. In 2009, a Broadway revival of Hair opened, and it won the Tony Award and the Drama Desk Award for Best Revival of a Musical. And as you know, Hair explores many of the themes of the hippie movement in the 60s. As with most satire, Hair makes fun of racism, war, sex, and other things by carrying them to ridiculous extremes. Hair shocks the audience by challenging what they believe, by showing how absurd, how offensive, how nonsensical, and in some cases, how dangerous are some of the behavior and language that society calls normal. Veteran theater writer and director Scott Miller writes, "The youth of America, especially those on college campuses, started protesting all the things that they saw wrong with America: racism, environmental destruction, poverty, sexism, sexual repression, violence at home, the war in Vietnam, depersonalization from new technologies, and corruption in politics." Contrary to popular opinion, most of the hippies had great respect for America and believed that they were the true patriots, the only ones who genuinely wanted to save our country and make it the best it could be once again. Long hair was the hippies' flag, their symbol not only of rebellion, but also of new possibilities, a symbol of the rejection of discrimination and restrictive gender roles. It symbolized equality between men and women. The hippies' chosen clothing also made statements. Drab work clothes, jeans and such, were a rejection of materialism. Clothing from other countries, particularly the Third World and Native Americans, represented their awareness of the global community and their rejection of U.S. imperialism and selfishness. Simple cotton dresses and other natural fabrics were a rejection of synthetics, a return to natural things and to simpler times. Hair challenges nearly everything we complacently accept as ordinary in life, things we often don't think about. It shoves them right into our face and demands that we look at them. Racism, sexual repression, violence, religion, religious hypocrisy, and other issues are all laid bare right there in front of us. And so the great song, "Let the Sunshine In," is not so much a happy song. It is a song to encourage us to take action. It is a call to action. The tribe is begging us, the audience, the congregation, to change things, to stop the killing, the hatred, the discrimination, the destruction of our world. They are saying that we are in a time of darkness, that it is now time to let the sun shine in and change things. It's significant that the lyric doesn't say that the sun is already shining and everything is going to be fine. It says we have to take action. We have to let the sun shine on things around us. And the implication is unmistakable. If we don't let the sun shine, it will be the end of us. Boy, that sure sounds a lot like the prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures, doesn't it? And like John the Baptist and Jesus, who talked about the kingdom of God, what the world would be like if God was king. In many ways, we in the West have kind of tamed and domesticated Jesus. We conveniently forget that he was a radical political activist. He was the center of a social movement that rejected the political and spiritual status quo of the time. He roamed the country, living a life of relative poverty, taking handouts of food and shelter from strangers, picking up supporters along the way, speaking on social and spiritual issues, challenging the government and the ruling classes, declaring that things must change. That's why they put him on a cross. That's how the Romans executed political threats, tortured and humiliated them in front of everybody to intimidate anybody else who might be inclined to do something similar. To keep everybody in line. Today's text that Bob read from us from the Gospel of Matthew is one of the few places in the Gospel, in all four of the Gospels, in which Jesus talks about a person's status in the afterlife, or at least in some world to come. In the 25th chapter of Matthew, he doesn't say that your status in the afterlife will be determined by what you believe, or by what church you go to, or by what religion you are, or by how much money you have, or what your reputation is like. In this parable about the sheep and the goats, a person's status in the afterlife is determined by how he or she responds to the less fortunate. And I can hear the hippies in the musical Hair say, "Right on, Jesus, right on." All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me." I don't think this story is the only biblical passage we should reflect on when we consider the afterlife. After all, God is God, and God is love, so we should never try to limit God and pretend to know what we know how God will respond. But I don't think this parable is the last and only word about one's status in the afterlife. Because the truth is, most of us are sheep sometimes, and most of us are goats sometimes. Rarely is anyone one or the other all the time. I imagine Jesus was encouraging people to be sheep as much as possible, to do what is right as much as possible, to help those who are down and out as much as possible. This was certainly the main emphasis in his ministry. And so if we are to be followers of Christ, this is something we need to take seriously. This is something we need to take action on. We need to let the sun shine in. Several weeks ago, I got an email from one of our choir members, Joe Poston. And Joe said, "We are going to do the song Easy to Be Hard on the Sunday we use Hair, aren't we?" "It's one of my favorites," she said. Well, I had not planned on using it. I was not familiar with it. I had overlooked it. So I listened to it and I wrote back to Joe, "Oh yes, this is the song that Three Dog Night recorded and made into a big hit. Now I remember it. And yes, it's all about social justice. And so yes, it will fit right in. We'll do it." And then later, I started listening more carefully to the song and to the lyrics. Something is not quite right here. There's something strange about these words. This isn't about social justice. In fact, it's criticizing folks who are so wrapped up in social justice issues that they forget to care for those who are around them, to those they are close to. When I moved back to Savannah in 1991, all of the United Methodist ministers in our Savannah district gathered together for a large meeting. There were about 50 of us. About 7 or 8 of them were ministers who had retired. One of them was the great Jason Shira, many of you know, and so that tells you the great quality of these retired ministers. Our district superintendent did a very smart thing. Since this was our first meeting of the season, and since many of us were rookies in the ministry, the district superintendent began the program by asking the retired ministers, these wise sages, if they could share one thing that they would have done differently in their ministry. Looking back, what would you have done differently? Almost every one of them had the very same response. They didn't say that they wished they had spent more time in prayer, or more time studying the Bible, or more time visiting the hospital, or more time focused on giving alms to the poor. What each of them wished they had done differently was spend more time with their family. And you could tell they meant it. There was a somberness in their tone and their posture. These were good men, wise men who had accomplished great things, but they realized that in some sense they had missed the mark because they focused so much on others, they didn't give what they felt they should have given to those closest to them. There's a story that was so important to the early church that it was included in every single one of the 4 Gospels. The story's told a little differently in each gospel, And the writers place it at a different time in Jesus' life. Most of the basic elements in each story involve a woman who pours very expensive ointment or perfume on Jesus. When the disciples realize this, they get very angry at her. They yell at her. They tell her she messed up, that this was an expensive perfume and it could have been sold to get money to give to the poor. But Jesus rebukes the disciples and says, this woman has done a good thing. You'll always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. Is this the man who suggested that the most important thing in life is to help the poor, to help those in need? Yes. But it also is important to balance truth with truth, to keep truth in tension, because it's also important to nurture and to cherish your loved ones. Jesus reminds us that your loved ones are rare treasures that are not permanent. This one who gave so much to others, he too was a rare treasure that was not permanent, and he too also needed to be given to receive. This one who loved and cared for others also needed to be loved and cared for time and time again. The ones that Jesus called friends would let him down, would not be there for him. You know, there's so many levels to this important message of how we treat those who are close to us. Everything from domestic violence that we're hearing more about, that has been in the closet for so long and really needs to be talked about and dealt with, to abandoning children, to verbal and physical abuse, to being a workaholic, to simply taking our loved ones for granted. Even if we wouldn't consider ourselves bad people, if we considered ourselves people like those retired ministers I mentioned earlier as good, caring people, many of us still struggle with giving our loved ones what we give others. We act one way in public and another in private. Many of us tend to give those close to us the leftovers. The disciples said, why did you use the expensive stuff? If you were going to bathe them, use the cheap stuff. Jesus reminds us that our loved ones, our spouse, our partner, our parents, our children, our relatives, our friends, the members of your faith community, they are rare treasures that are not permanent. Cherish them. Love them. When I went to YouTube to listen to the song that Joe encouraged us to use in the service, I read some of the comments listed. You know how they put the comments under the song? So I read some of them, and one of them was by a young man who wrote this. This song reminds me of my dad. He's an old hippie, and he's out to save the world. But he never calls or contacts me unless he wants something. And he's consistently refused to Skype with his granddaughter. He's never even spoken to her. Ironically, he's the one who showed me hair when I was young to encourage me to be good to people.